Within hours of Iran's missile barrage striking an American base in the region, Iranian state television was already declaring total victory. A devastating blow against American forces, aircraft destroyed, casualties in the dozens, a humiliating defeat for the world's most powerful military. It was the kind of announcement designed to dominate headlines, rally domestic support, and send a message of strength to every audience watching, at home and abroad. There was just one problem. When independent satellite imagery, verified video footage, and on-the-ground reporting actually caught up with the claims, the story that emerged looked almost nothing like what Iranian state media had announced to the world. You need to understand exactly how this gap between claim and reality opened up, because it tells you almost everything about how modern information warfare actually works in a conflict like this one, and why, in an age of commercial satellites and instantly shareable video, even a government's own state broadcaster can no longer fully control the narrative around a military strike, no matter how quickly it moves to shape the story. Let's walk through exactly what happened. In the hours following the strike, Iranian state broadcasters aired dramatic footage of missile launches, control room celebrations, and commanders publicly declaring that the attack had achieved catastrophic results against American military infrastructure. Iranian officials, speaking through state media channels, specifically claimed extensive destruction of aircraft, structures, and personnel at the targeted base, framing the strike as a proportionate and devastating response to prior American and Allied military action against Iranian territory and personnel. Within the tightly controlled information environment inside Iran, this narrative spread quickly and unchallenged, exactly as designed. The production quality and speed of this initial broadcast is itself worth examining closely. Within a remarkably short window after the missiles landed, Iranian state television had already assembled a polished segment combining launch footage, maps showing the strike's supposed trajectory, and confident commentary from military spokespeople describing the operation as a complete success. Media analysts who have studied Iran's state broadcasting apparatus over the years note that this kind of rapid, professionally produced response requires significant advanced preparation, suggesting that segments of this coverage, the launch footage, and a general narrative framing in particular, were likely prepared and ready to air before the actual battlefield outcome of the strike was even known. A level of narrative, first, evidence, second, production, that itself hints at how these announcements are designed to function primarily as domestic messaging, rather than accurate battlefield reporting. Here is where things get really interesting. Almost as soon as the Iranian claims went public, independent researchers and open-source intelligence analysts, the same community that has spent years tracking satellite imagery of nuclear sites and military movements across the region, began pulling commercial satellite photos of the exact coordinates named in Iranian state media reports. What those images showed diverged sharply from the official Iranian account. Instead of a base reduced to rubble, analysts identified a handful of damaged structures, some cratering consistent with missile impacts, and clear evidence that American and Allied forces had received sufficient advance warning to disperse aircraft and personnel away from the most likely impact zones before the strike ever landed. I want you to hear how this kind of verification process actually works, because it's more methodical than most people realize. According to an open-source intelligence analyst who has spent years cross-referencing military strike claims against satellite and video evidence, the first step is always geolocation, matching any video or photo evidence circulating online against known satellite imagery of the claimed location, using landmarks, building layouts, and terrain features to confirm exactly where footage was actually filmed. Once location is confirmed, analysts compare before and after satellite images of that specific site, looking for new crater patterns, structural damage, or debris fields that would corroborate the scale of destruction being claimed. In this case, according to her account, the pre-strike satellite imagery showed rows of aircraft and vehicles parked in their normal positions, while post-strike imagery showed those same rows conspicuously empty, direct visual evidence that the base had been evacuated of its most valuable assets before the missiles ever arrived. This geolocation process is painstaking, often involving dozens of small visual comparisons that most viewers, scrolling past a dramatic video clip, would never think to check. Analysts look at things like the specific angle of a building's roofline against known satellite imagery, the exact spacing between perimeter fencing and nearby structures, or even the shadows cast by objects at a specific time of day, which can be cross-referenced against known sun positioning for that exact location and date to confirm whether footage was actually filmed when and where it claims to have been. In several previous instances of contested strike footage from this same conflict, researchers have identified video that was either recycled from entirely unrelated prior incidents or digitally altered to exaggerate visible damage, underscoring exactly why this slow, methodical verification process matters so much before any footage can be treated as reliable evidence of what actually happened. So why would American and Allied forces have advance warning of an attack that Iran wanted to appear as a surprise, devastating blow? The answer lies in a pattern that has repeated itself across several prior instances of Iranian retaliatory strikes against American positions in the region. Iranian officials have, on multiple documented occasions, used diplomatic backchannels, often through intermediary governments, to signal the general timing and nature of planned retaliatory strikes in advance, a calculated move that Western defense analysts believe is designed to allow Iran to claim it has taken decisive military action to satisfy domestic political pressure, while simultaneously avoiding American casualties significant enough to trigger an overwhelming American counterresponse that Iran's leadership understands its own military could not survive. This advance warning dynamic reflects a broader strategic logic that has defined much of Iran's military posture toward the United States for years, sometimes described by regional analysts as a strategy of calibrated escalation. The underlying idea is straightforward. Iran's leadership wants to demonstrate, both to its own domestic audience and to allied proxy networks across the region, that it is willing and able to strike back against American forces when provoked, without actually crossing a threshold of American casualties severe enough to make a large-scale American military response politically unavoidable. Achieving that balance requires exactly the kind of advance signaling that allows American forces to disperse personnel and valuable equipment before a strike lands, producing dramatic launch footage and impressive-looking craters, while keeping the actual human cost low enough that Washington's political calculus does not shift toward major retaliation. This is where we need to widen the picture, because this exact pattern, dramatic claims followed by underwhelming physical evidence, is not new. It closely mirrors an earlier well-documented episode from several years ago when Iran launched a large-scale ballistic missile strike against American forces stationed in Iraq in retaliation for the killing of one of its most senior military commanders. In that earlier case, Iranian state media similarly claimed dozens of American casualties in the immediate aftermath. It was only in the following weeks, as the Pentagon gradually confirmed a wave of traumatic brain injuries among American service members exposed to the blast concussions, that the actual human cost of that strike became clear, serious, but dramatically different in both scale and nature from Iran's initial public claims of a devastating body count. That earlier episode established a template that both sides have referenced repeatedly since. For Iran, dramatic initial claims serve an immediate domestic political purpose, regardless of how thoroughly they get walked back or contradicted by evidence in the following days and weeks, because by the time independent verification catches up, the initial narrative has already done its job domestically, reinforcing the government's message of strength and resolve. For Western governments and independent researchers, the lesson has been to treat any initial claims of catastrophic damage from an Iranian strike with structured skepticism, waiting for satellite confirmation and verified footage before drawing conclusions, a process that inevitably takes days, by which point the initial dramatic headlines have already shaped public perception in ways that slower, more accurate reporting struggles to fully correct. This earlier incident also permanently changed how the Pentagon handles casualty reporting after strikes like this. Following criticism that initial American statements understated the true medical impact of that earlier attack, before the full scope of traumatic brain injuries became clear weeks later, defense officials adopted a more deliberately cautious reporting posture, acknowledging that some injuries, particularly concussive brain trauma from blast waves, are not always immediately apparent and can take days or weeks of medical evaluation to properly diagnose. That shift means official American casualty figures released in the immediate aftermath of a strike like this one are now understood, even by the Pentagon itself, to represent an early, potentially incomplete picture, a nuance that gets lost entirely in Iran's own confident, immediate declarations of catastrophic American losses. Let's talk about the specific verified footage that emerged in the days following this most recent strike, because it tells a story dramatically different from Iran's official narrative. Video geolocated by multiple independent researchers to the actual base perimeter showed American and Allied personnel calmly moving through undamaged sections of the facility within hours of the strike, a level of normal operational activity entirely inconsistent with the scale of devastation Iranian state media had claimed. Separate footage, verified by cross-referencing distinctive building features against known satellite imagery, showed base personnel actively assessing and beginning repair work on the limited structural damage that had occurred, further undercutting the narrative of a base rendered inoperable. Multiple independent researchers, working separately with different sets of source material, reportedly reached strikingly consistent conclusions about the scale of actual damage, a level of independent corroboration that specialists consider particularly strong evidence in open source verification work. One widely cited analysis compared the total number of distinct impact craters visible in verified satellite imagery against the number of missiles Iran's own state media claimed to have launched in the barrage, finding a significant gap between the two figures, evidence consistent with a substantial number of missiles either missing their intended target entirely, failing during flight, or being intercepted by American and Allied air defense systems before ever reaching the base. That gap alone, independent of any question about casualties or specific structural damage, cuts directly against Iran's characterization of the strike as a fully successful precision operation. Perhaps most tellingly, no verified footage or credible independent reporting has emerged supporting Iran's specific claims regarding casualty figures. Defense officials have, through official statements, confirmed only minor injuries among personnel at the base, a figure dramatically at odds with the casualty numbers cited by Iranian state broadcasters in the immediate aftermath of the strike. This gap between claimed and confirmed casualties has become one of the most consistently documented patterns across multiple Iranian strikes over the years, one that has led several independent conflict researchers to treat Iranian state media casualty claims specifically as requiring the highest level of independent scrutiny before being reported as fact. Bellingcat, the open-source investigative organization that has built its reputation over years of painstaking geolocation and verification work across multiple global conflicts, has previously outlined the exact methodology being applied to strikes like this one. According to their published verification guides, the core process involves triangulating multiple independent sources, satellite imagery, geolocated video, flight tracking data, and official statements from involved parties, and only drawing firm conclusions once at least two independent categories of evidence align. Applying that exact methodology to this strike, according to researchers who have published preliminary findings, the available satellite and video evidence points overwhelmingly toward a strike that caused limited structural damage and minimal casualties, a picture entirely inconsistent with Iran's official public claims. This methodology has itself become a kind of specialized discipline over the past decade, developed and refined across conflicts far beyond just the Middle East, from the war in Ukraine to civil conflicts in Africa and Latin America, wherever state actors and armed groups have strong incentives to control the narrative around specific incidents. What makes this discipline particularly powerful in the Iran context specifically is the sheer density of prior verified imagery available for cross-referencing, decades of satellite coverage of Iranian military and nuclear sites, combined with an unusually active community of Persian-speaking open-source researchers, some based outside Iran specifically because of the political risk of doing this work from within the country, who bring language and cultural context to social media verification that purely technical satellite analysis alone cannot provide. This gap between propaganda and physical reality raises an important question about why Iran continues to make claims that independent researchers can, and reliably do, disprove within days using nothing more than commercial satellite imagery and geolocated social media footage. Regional analysts studying Iran's information strategy have pointed out that the primary audience for these dramatic claims is not the international community, which Iranian officials understand will eventually access independent verification, but Iran's own domestic population, along with allied and proxy networks across the region who rely heavily on Iranian state media as their primary source of information about these events. For that specific audience, largely insulated from independent Western verification sources due to internet restrictions and information controls, the initial dramatic claims often remain the dominant narrative, long after independent researchers elsewhere have thoroughly debunked the specific details. Gulf state officials, watching this exact pattern play out again, have reportedly grown increasingly comfortable publicly, citing independent satellite verification to push back against Iranian claims in real time. A notable shift from earlier years, when Gulf governments were more cautious about directly contradicting Iranian state media narratives. This growing willingness to lean on independent, verifiable open-source evidence reflects a broader shift across the region, where access to commercial satellite imagery and crowdsourced verification tools has meaningfully changed the balance of power between state propaganda and independently confirmed fact in a way that would have been far more difficult to achieve even a decade ago. Saudi and Emirati state media outlets, which have historically been far more cautious than Western outlets about directly contradicting Iranian narratives, given the sensitivity of the broader regional relationship, reportedly amplified independent satellite analysis of this specific strike more quickly and more directly than in comparable incidents from previous years. Regional media analysts have pointed to this shift as evidence of hardening Gulf state attitudes toward Iran following the extended period of tension around the nuclear program, the carrier deployments, and the leaked reports of a new hidden facility, suggesting that Gulf governments increasingly view public, evidence-based pushback against Iranian propaganda as consistent with their broader strategic posture, rather than a risk to be carefully managed as it may have been treated in calmer periods of the relationship. Israeli defense officials have also weighed in on this specific strike. characterizing Iran's claims as a familiar pattern of exaggeration designed primarily for domestic and regional propaganda purposes rather than an accurate battlefield assessment. Israeli intelligence assessments, portions of which have reportedly been shared with American counterparts, have consistently emphasized what officials describe as a significant gap between Iran's demonstrated missile capabilities on paper and their actual operational effectiveness in real strikes, citing recurring issues with guidance system reliability and interception rates by American and Allied air defense systems that have, according to these assessments, prevented the vast majority of Iranian missiles from ever reaching their intended targets with meaningful accuracy. This gap between Iran's missile inventory on paper and its actual demonstrated battlefield performance has become a recurring theme across multiple recent strikes, not just this one. Israeli and American assessments reviewed by defense journalists over the past year have repeatedly pointed to production quality issues in certain classes of Iranian missiles, along with degraded guidance system performance that Western officials attribute in part to the same sanctions-driven inability to import certain precision electronic components that has also constrained Iran's civilian infrastructure and energy sectors. Whatever the precise technical cause, the practical result, according to these assessments, is a persistent and measurable gap between Iran's stated missile capabilities in public announcements and the far more limited real-world accuracy and reliability its forces have demonstrated in actual combat use, a gap that shows up again and again whenever independent researchers get the chance to verify a specific strike's real physical outcome. American defense officials, for their part, have taken a notably measured public tone in response to Iran's claims, neither confirming the dramatic damage narrative nor engaging extensively in public rebuttal, a posture that defense analysts believe is deliberate. According to this analysis, downplaying and refusing to publicly engage with exaggerated Iranian claims denies Tehran the kind of extended news cycle and public back and forth that would only amplify the initial propaganda value of the claims in the first place. Instead, American officials have generally allowed independent researchers and journalists to do the work of contradicting Iranian claims through verified evidence, a strategy that keeps the American government's own public statements minimal while still allowing the actual, more accurate picture of events to eventually reach a wide international audience through credible, independent channels. This restrained public posture has its own critics inside Washington, however. Some lawmakers have argued that the Pentagon's reluctance to more forcefully and immediately correct the record after strikes like this one cedes valuable ground in the broader information environment, allowing Iran's initial dramatic claims to circulate widely across the region and among Iranian-aligned media outlets for days before independent verification catches up and receives comparable attention. Defense officials briefing lawmakers on this exact criticism have generally defended the measured approach, arguing that overly aggressive American rebuttals in the immediate aftermath of a strike risk appearing defensive, and that independent, non-governmental verification carries substantially more credibility with skeptical international audiences than any statement issued directly by the American military itself, precisely because it comes from parties without an obvious stake in the narrative outcome. This pattern of information warfare surrounding military strikes fits into a much broader and longer-running dynamic between Iran and the outside world, one that echoes almost exactly the same themes running through the nuclear standoff itself. Just as Iran spent 2 decades building hidden nuclear facilities only to have them repeatedly exposed by outside satellite imagery and independent verification, Iran's approach to battlefield claims follows an identical playbook. Assert a dramatic version of events for immediate domestic political benefit, and rely on the fact that full, independent verification takes time during which the initial narrative has already served its intended political purpose. In both cases, the ultimate outcome has been strikingly similar: an initial official Iranian narrative that dominates headlines for days, followed by a slower, quieter process of independent verification that reveals a substantially different, and usually far less dramatic, reality. There's a broader media literacy lesson embedded in this exact pattern, one that extends well beyond this single strike, or even this single conflict. Researchers who study information warfare across multiple global conflicts have noted that the specific tactics on display here, rapid state media claims paired with pre-produced footage, followed inevitably by a slower independent verification process, have become a standard feature of how modern military escalations are fought in the information space, regardless of which country or which conflict is involved. What makes the Iran case a particularly useful example for understanding this broader pattern is the sheer consistency with which it has repeated itself. From the earlier retaliatory strike years ago to the ongoing nuclear disclosures, to this most recent incident, offering a clear, repeatable case study in exactly how the gap between initial claims and eventual verified reality tends to open up and eventually close. Let's zoom out and consider what this means for how ordinary people, watching this conflict unfold from thousands of kilometers away, should actually process the wave of dramatic claims and counterclaims that accompany every new strike or escalation in this ongoing standoff. The lesson from this specific incident, and from the pattern it fits into, is not that Iranian statements should be dismissed reflexively without any consideration, but that any claim from any party in an active conflict, whether from Tehran, Washington, Jerusalem, or anywhere else, deserves to be treated as an initial position rather than a confirmed fact, until independent satellite imagery, geolocated video, and cross-referenced reporting have had time to actually verify what happened on the ground. In an age where commercial satellites photograph nearly every corner of the Earth multiple times a day, and where millions of smartphone cameras exist within range of nearly any strike, that kind of independent verification usually arrives faster than most people expect, but it still takes time. And in that gap, propaganda narratives on every side of a conflict like this one have a window to shape public perception before the more accurate picture ever catches up. Step back and look at the full arc of what happened here. A missile strike launched with real military intent and real consequences. A dramatic Iranian state media narrative announced within hours, designed for immediate domestic political impact. A wave of independent satellite imagery and geolocated footage, painstakingly assembled by open-source researchers over the following days, revealing a physical reality of limited damage and minimal casualties dramatically at odds with the official claims. Gulf states and Israeli officials citing that independent evidence publicly to push back on the narrative in near real time. American officials choosing calculated public silence rather than amplifying the story through direct rebuttal. And underneath all of it, the same core dynamic that has defined Iran's relationship with the outside world for over 2 decades now, a persistent gap between what Tehran claims and what the rest of the world, armed with satellites, smartphones, and a growing global network of independent researchers, can actually verify to be true. What makes this pattern so durable, despite being exposed again and again across so many separate incidents, is that it still works, at least for the audience it was actually designed for. Iranian state media does not need Western fact-checkers or open-source researchers to believe its claims. It needs its own domestic population and allied networks across the region who rely on the same information ecosystem to feel, in the moment, that Iran has struck back forcefully against a more powerful adversary. By the time satellite imagery and geolocated footage arrive to complicate that narrative, days later filtered through international outlets that much of that same domestic audience may never see or trust in the first place, the political job the initial announcement was designed to do has largely already been accomplished. Understanding that distinction between a claim's effectiveness as propaganda and its accuracy as fact may be the single most useful lens for making sense of every strike, counterstrike, and dueling announcement still to come in this ongoing standoff. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you see through the headlines to what actually happened, make sure to like this video and drop your take in the comments. It genuinely helps this analysis reach more people trying to separate fact from propaganda in this fast-moving conflict. We'll keep tracking every new claim and every piece of verified evidence as this story continues to unfold.